Welcome everyone to the Sourdough Delight Kung Fu Baker with Sourdough Delight. And today we've got a lineup of 5 different flours that we're going to test, visually inspect. What does it look like? What does it feel like? How is it responding when you mix it with water so that we understand the properties of flour? And that way, when you're baking, you get a feel for truly if everything is going well or if it's not, and then you can adjust. Let's begin. First, I want to show you that I've measured 25 grams in these jars. So obviously the jar weighs a certain amount. So this one's 205, this one's 206, 7, 206, 208, and finally 207. So obviously there's a slight variation in the jar weight, but in essence we've got 25 grams across the board of flour. So now we're going to mix them with our water. So we've got a bread flour from a previous batch that I know when I sent in back to the manufacturer, it had lower protein than what a bread flour should be. So what I've noticed is the texture of a pastry flour is more clumpy versus smooth. For example, let's check out this pastry flour and butt it up to this bread flour. Okay, supposedly bread flour. You see how they have similar textures? Okay, oops, let's see if I can zoom in. Yeah, you see that? All right, now let's bring in this one, which is an all-purpose flour. So that one has a little bit of a smoother texture. You see that? It's not so clumpy. So let's see if I can back out here so you get a better response. Now, the pastry flour, the true pastry flour, is definitely clumpy versus somewhat clumpy versus a little bit smoother. Okay, now this one is a brand new bread flour that I just picked up this morning, and look at that. You could just tell already that it's a lot smoother in its texture, right? Now we're just going to assume that they're very close in regards to the amount of bran and germ that are actually in this. So we're not dealing with whole wheat flour here. We're just dealing with a straight white flour. And then this one is this is the mystery batch, which I just used and had to throw away 72 pounds worth of dough, which was a bit of a bummer, but now we're making it a great learning experience for us to just become better bakers. So again, slightly clumpy, right? This one is slightly smooth. And now we're going to mix water and really get a feel for how they respond to that. So first I'm just going to fill them all up to 25 and get a feel for. Now, okay, so maybe 28 grams. In fact, I'm going to bring out the dropper and really dial it into 30 grams, and that will be our baseline for all of them. So while I do that, I'm going to just pause the video because obviously you don't really need to watch this part, or maybe you do want to watch this part. So we'll fill up this guy and finish it off with our dropper, which again, just for experimentation purposes, we want to be as accurate as possible. So I'll finish that up. All right, so we've got 30 grams in each, and I'm just taking a quick visual to see what's happening and how the flour is absorbing water. So let's take a closer look. Let's see, the bread flours, most of the flour has sunk across the board. The pastry flour looks like it's got some clumps on the surface there. Everything else seems to have sunk, maybe not that one. Okay, but for the most part, they've all settled. Now let's take a chopstick and just give it a slight stir, see what happens. Just a slight stir, just to start the game here. Slight stir, see if I can feel any difference going on, because obviously as water and flour start mixing and the flour absorbs the water, the gluten, the proteins start to generate their magic. And, oh, that one feels interesting. That one feels much easier to stir. And that's what I found when I was mixing large batches of sourdough starter. They were all loose, meaning super easy to stir, very slack, almost like batter for pancakes or waffles or what have you, versus like thick dough. And that was a telltale, but I wasn't paying attention to it. And then I just thought, well, maybe it relaxed a little too long and got a little slack as the lactic bacteria is creating extra, liquid from the acidic acid and such. But that wasn't the case. In fact, it was just the weaker protein makeup of the flour, which is just easier to mix because it's not as strong. And that's why they refer to high protein flour, bread flour, as strong flour, because its makeup is, strong, versus pastry flour has low gluten, low protein, which is obviously would be easier and more tender. That's why you want to use it for cakes and muffins. And then all purpose being a mixture of both bread and pastry flour. So you kind of get the best of both worlds there. Here's my all purpose. So I'm going to let that just sit for a minute and then come back and just stir them a little bit more efficiently. Now we do have a little bit of a color difference, but that's okay. It might just be my lighting here. So far they're relatively responding the same in regards to how easy it is to mix. There's slight variations. The bread flours are a little bit firmer versus the pastry flour here. And we're gonna stir that a little bit more thoroughly here off camera and see if I notice any other tidbits to share with you. Okay, we're back. And what I've noticed is definitely the pastry flour was much easier to incorporate and mix thoroughly, the dry and wet ingredients. The bread flours, which are this one and this one, along with all purpose, gave a little bit more resistance. It's a little more clumpier. You see how this one's nice and firm, or rather smooth. The pastry flour is nice and smooth versus the all purpose is a little bit more clumpier. Right. Bread flour is a little bit more clumpier. This one definitely is a little bit more clumpier. It has that big chunk there. And a little bit clumpy as well. So now I'm going to give this about a 15-minute rest to see how the texture is going to change between all these flours and see if I notice a big difference or really any difference. But before we go into that 15-minute rest, I did want to share with you what I look for when I'm mixing my sourdough starters and or doughs. One thing is, can I see the bottom of the jar when I mix? You see how this is the pastry flour, and it's super smooth. I mean, it's very watery. It just kind of drips, right? Now let's grab the all-purpose. And that one, you see how I can kind of see the bottom, at least the sides, when I stir? And you see it dragging and creating that like elasticity, those trails. Okay, not as stretchy, but definitely has a little bit more. Right? It doesn't just goo and drip. Let's go back to that pastry flour so you can see that difference. This one just literally falls. Look at that. As I scoop, it just breaks. The all-purpose had a little bit more resistance. And I can even feel it now as it's resting and that gluten is starting to develop. Okay, now let's go to the previous batch, which I did get tested and it said it was low in protein. I do feel the ease of mixing, so it is behaving more like as a pastry flour. Wow, look at that. It just totally falls apart. Look at that. not really hanging on at all. Just boop, breaks very easily. So that's going to tell you that when you make dough out of it and your bread dough, it's just going to fall apart, right? So pay attention to how your sourdough starter is responding, how it feels, how it looks, how high it's rising in your jar, which is another thing I noticed in my sourdough starter when I had that failed batch, is I was looking at the line to see when it was going to start to fall versus how high it actually went on the jar. And when I looked back, it should have been up here, but it was more like here when it was done. And it's not like it was a super hot day where it like rose really fast and then dropped by the time I saw it. So, okay, let's take a look again. This is bread flour, but this is the new batch that I just bought today. And that one, oh, had a little bit of a stretcher. Not sure if that was just a coincidence, but let's take another look. Okay, it's got a little bit of stretch there. Yeah, definitely. Look at that. It's starting to clump and get gooey enough to stay on the chopstick. Yeah, okay. And then this one is the mystery batch of the new batch that I had that failed. Again, this one, the previous batch, was a batch that did get tested by the company, by the supplier, and they did confirm that it was very low in protein, which obviously the thing isn't even sticking. Look at that, right? And it's been about 10 minutes since we started this exercise or experiment. And then this one is the one I just used that I ended up pitching and gave to my chickens out there. Sadly, or rather fortunately, I actually had a use for it versus just tossing it in the trash. So mystery batch. This is the one that failed. That I'm not sure. You see, it's just literally falling apart. Slight elasticity, but I mean definitely just falling apart. Look at that. Oh, but for the most part, definitely not responding like a high gluten bread flour, which is what it should be. Okay. All right. We'll finish and let that rest. Now, as we wait for those, I just opened up a 50-pound bag of a new flour from the same brand I was having issues with. Now, I'm not going to mention names of any of the flours that we're using because really it's not about bashing or promoting a certain brand. It's really to become a better baker. And that's the goal here, to use our senses: visual, sound, smell, feel, taste, the whole nine. Even when I was taking my scooper and I was scooping flour, it sounds different when I'm going into pastry flour versus bread flour. And that's the level of awareness I'm trying to bring to your attention, really, because the more aware we are, the better bakers we can be. And really, the better people, better in our craft. It just hits every facet of life. So here we go. Just mixed this batch, and it sadly was clumpy in the bag. Remember how we were first looking at the texture of the raw flour? And when I mixed it in the water, as I'm stirring like so, it was still rough looking. When when you're done kneading dough, it has that smooth, elastic surface. And that's not what I was getting when I was first mixing this. Now it's starting to smooth out a bit. However, it still has that granule look and texture. And as I'm pulling, I mean, there's like zero resistance here for this much flour. It's a 100, it's a 1-to-1 ratio, so 100 grams of flour to 100 grams of water. So we'll see how this one works out, and if I'm going to be using my new bag of flour or if I'm just going to go to the supermarket and pick up some other brand to use for this next coming batch. We'll see. All right. All right, we're back in action. So I'm going to position our camera here. So first we're going to check out the pastry flour. Angle it a little lower so you can see it. So at this point, I'm just going to grab the chopstick really lightly on top with maybe just 3 fingers and get a feel for how it's rotating. Okay. So right now, pretty easy to mix. It's not giving me too much resistance. Most of it is stirring well. Not too many traces, meaning if I go really fast, right? It's not creating a wake. And when I lift up, just breaks clean. Not much elasticity there. Okay, so that is the pastry flour. All right, next we're going to do the all-purpose flour. See how that one feels. So a little bit more resistance, but not that much. I definitely have to squeeze the chopstick firmer in order to mix it. Oh, and you see how it's just dragging the jar a little. And all right, a little bit of a stretch there. Not much, but it is an all-purpose flour, right? We're not expecting anything too elastic there from that. So this is the previous batch. Again, this one is the known that tested by their lab, the supplier's lab, that it was low in protein. So this one feels as easy as the pastry flour to stir, if not more, and also breaks pretty clean. Yep, not much there. So if I bake bread with this flour, it's just gonna not work out well, right? It's not gonna hold its shape. It's not gonna give me that texture that's nice and fluffy that I want from bread. Okay, so this is my mysterious batch, which is the last batch I used that I dumped 72 pounds worth in my compost / chicken run. They are my go-to composters. So this one's at least moving the jar when I stir a little. And not much there. Slight elasticity. Okay. So, which confirms why I had to dump 72 pounds worth of dough, right? So here's the new flour that I just bought at the grocery store again. This one, a little bit more resistance, definitely. We'll move the jar a little. Okay. For the most part, it just feels like it's stuck, and I'm moving more of the flour, rather more of the dough, than stirring through the dough, if that makes sense. The whole thing is kind of moving as one mass, if you can tell. Let's go back to the pastry flour to see the difference there. You see how this is stirring and I'm cutting through the dough versus the new bread flour. The whole thing just kind of moves as one clump. Okay, and it's giving me definitely some stretchability there. You see that? Some elasticity. Let's see, one last one. Nice and slow, look at that. Okay, so I'll definitely be baking with that later. And lastly, we have the big batch here of the new 50-pound bag of flour from the same supplier that I've been having issues with. They do have awesome customer service, so we're going to be working with each other Monday to see if we can find a solution here, because I do love the quality of their product normally, and the purity of their product is great. They don't put extra enzymes, dough conditioners, all that jazz in it, so it's a very clean flour, which is why I chose it to begin with. So I'm really looking forward to them knocking this issue out so that we can continue doing business. So that one just falls apart. Now this one definitely hasn't been resting as long as the other ones. This one's been maybe half the time. Unfortunately, it is cutting through the dough as I mix, just like the pastry flour was. See that? And that is a great telltale now that we've learned what to look for. So I really appreciate you guys hanging on through this whole process, because I think it will add value to our craft, right? Our skill set as a baker. So a little bit of elasticity there. Not so we'll see. I'll let this one sit for another 10 minutes or so, see how it changes, and maybe do a test batch, small loaf or two with it. So quick rundown on what we've learned in this experiment to become better bakers. One, visual. What does it look like? Is it clumpy? Is it smooth? What does it sound like when you're scooping it? What does it feel like when your hands are in the flour and working the dough? Is it starting to build elasticity? Is it not? Is it taking too long? Is it not rising right in your jar when you're feeding your sourdough starter? Because how your starter reacts is how your dough is going to react too. In essence, your sourdough starter is your dough. It just happens to have less water in it in the final product. All right. So again, thank you for joining me, Noris the Kung Fu Baker from Sourdough Delight. Wishing you an awesome, happy day. Take care.